Why do you recite ancient verses simply hoping for, I don't know, general blessings or a bit of spiritual comfort before bed, when the text sitting right in front of you might actually be a radical operational blueprint for socioeconomic justice?
It's a heavy question.
Seriously, think about that for a second. Imagine you're wandering through a desert, right?
Yeah.
And you stumble upon a set of incredibly detailed architectural blueprints.
Right.
These blueprints outline exactly how to build a futuristic, completely self-sustaining, perfectly equitable city. It shows you the water filtration systems, the power grid, the housing layout. I mean, literally everything you need to survive and thrive.
The whole system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But instead of gathering the materials and actually building the city, you take these blueprints, you frame them in gold, you hang them on a wall, and you just stand in front of them every single day, chanting the measurements.
Yeah, reciting them.
Right. You're saying, the wall is 10 feet high, the pipe is 3 inches wide, blessings be upon the pipe.
That's incredibly bleak.
But you aren't building anything, you're just venerating the instructions.
It's a tragic image, really.
Yeah.
But honestly, it is precisely what has happened to some of the most profound historical texts we possess. We have fallen into what the source material we are examining today calls the ritual trap.
The ritual trap.
Right. We've taken a civilizational blueprint like a highly specific socioeconomic engine designed to eradicate poverty and dismantle tyranny. And we have reduced it to a mere religious placeholder. We've totally defanged it.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We've got a massive stack of intense source material on the table, specifically translated notes and transcriptions of a profoundly disruptive lecture by Allama G. Parwez.
It's a brilliant piece of analysis.
It really is. He's analyzing Surah Al-Imran from the Quran, specifically verses 3.52 through 58, and he's operating entirely from the Quranic rationalist school of thought.
Which is key here.
Right. And our mission in this deep dive is to completely upend how you might be looking at this text and, by extension, how you look at history itself. So how did we get here? How does a society take a revolutionary blueprint and turn it into a static screensaver?
To understand that, we really have to look at the fundamental philosophical distinction at the heart of Parwez's lecture. It is the distinction between two concepts, din and mazhab.
Din and mazhab.
Yeah. If we don't grasp the mechanics of these two terms, honestly, nothing about the historical manipulation we are going to discuss will make any sense.
I mean, I always thought mazhab was just the colloquial word for religion. Are we talking about two totally different things here?
Entirely different paradigms. According to the rationalist framework presented in our sources, din is an active, comprehensive socioeconomic system.
Active being the operative word.
Exactly. It's a system of life, governed by divine laws, yes. But those laws are meant to manifest in the real physical world as a system of governance, economics, and jurisprudence. It demands equity. Mazhab, on the other hand, is what we traditionally understand as religion today. It is passive. It's ritualistic.
Like personal piety?
Yeah, it's highly individualized, deeply concerned with internal spiritual feelings, and private worship.
Okay, so din is the operating system running the entire computer, managing the memory, allocating the power, protecting the hardware. And mazhab is just the screensaver.
That's a great way to put it.
It looks pretty, it gives you a nice feeling, but it doesn't actually run any of the critical infrastructure.
Exactly. And the crucial question the source material asks is, well, why did humanity shift from din to mazhab?
Was it just an accident?
Parwez argues this was absolutely not a natural linguistic evolution or some accident of history. It was a deliberate, highly orchestrated, and historically violent shift driven by vested interests.
Who specifically?
Specifically, the alliance of political tyrants and religious elites.
Hold on, I need to push back on this a little, just to play devil's advocate. Are we sure Parwez isn't just reverse engineering a modern anti-capitalist political ideology and projecting it backward onto ancient spiritual texts?
That's a fair point.
Because saying the elite deliberately rewrote religion to protect their wealth sounds, a bit like a 20th century Marxist critique layered over a 7th century text.
It's a totally fair skepticism, and it's one the source material actually anticipates. But Parwez isn't importing modern sociology here. He is pointing to the explicit historical mechanics described in the verses themselves.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics then.
Let's look at the historical case study the lecture focuses on.
Yeah.
The era of Jesus, or Isa, in the first century. Think about how Jesus is almost universally portrayed in our culture today.
Regardless of your background, the cultural image is pretty uniform. He's a peaceful, wandering, ascetic monk.
Right.
A solitary figure with a lamb over his shoulders who possessed absolutely nothing, who preached total passivity, and who essentially said, if they oppress you, just turn the other cheek.
Yeah, and Parwez argues this image is a fabricated mazhab narrative. It is the result of manipulated historical texts, like the corrupted versions of gospel narratives, written decades and centuries after the fact,
Written by who?
by individuals and institutions that needed to make the core message palatable to the ruling Roman Empire. Under the din framework presented in Surah Al-Imran, the historical Jesus was a powerful socio-political revolutionary.
So if you're listening to this right now, does this mean the historical image you grew up with, the ultimate peaceful ascetic, was actually a deliberate PR spin by the ruling class to pacify the masses?
Exactly. Let's look at the actual mechanics of the first century economy in Judea to understand why. You had a dual tyranny crushing the population. On one side, the Roman imperial administration.
Right, the colonizers.
Right. They operated a brutal extraction economy. They demanded heavy taxation, the tributum, which literally siphoned the agricultural surplus and wealth of the provinces back to Rome to fund their military and their elite.
The classic imperial model. Bleed the colonies dry to build marble palaces back in the capital.
Precisely. But the Roman administration couldn't extract all that wealth on their own. They needed local collaborators. And that brings us to the second, and arguably more insidious, layer of tyranny.
The local elite.
The exploitative local religious establishment. The Quranic text refers to these professional religious classes generally as the Abar and Ruban, the priestly elites and the monks.
Okay.
In the context of Jesus' time, this was the deeply entrenched, wealthy Sadducean aristocracy and the bureaucratic religious scholars who controlled the temple in Jerusalem.
But how exactly did they oppress the people? Because usually we think of priests as just conducting ceremonies, not running an extraction economy.
And see, that is the mazhab view of priests. The historical reality of the Abar was that the temple functioned essentially as the central bank of the region.
Wait, really? A bank?
Oh, absolutely. They controlled a vast, complex web of religious laws that required the common people to pay constant tithes, purchase specific, hyperinflated temple-approved animals for mandatory sacrifices, and exchange their Roman coins for pure temple coins at extortionate exchange rates.
Wow.
It was a massive financial monopoly guarded by claims of divine authority.
Okay, the picture is getting much clearer now. So Jesus wasn't just walking into the temple and saying, hey guys, your theology is a little off, let's pray differently.
Not at all.
He was walking into the central bank and flipping over the tables of the money changers. He was threatening their entire economic supply chain.
Yes. He was attempting to reestablish a din and equitable socio-economic system. A din demands that wealth be circulated fairly, that the courts cannot be bought, and that no human being has unchecked sovereign authority over another human being's livelihood.
Which is a huge threat.
It is an existential threat to an empire and a corrupt priesthood. A mazhab, however, is incredibly convenient for those rulers.
Because it keeps people quiet.
Exactly. Mazhab teaches the poor man that his suffering in this world makes him holy, and that if he is just patient and passive while his labor is stolen, he will get a mansion in the afterlife.
It's the ultimate control mechanism. You literally convince the people you are robbing that fighting back against the robbery is a sin.
It's brilliant and terrible.
So by turning Jesus into a harmless, passive hermit in later histories, the ruling elite neutralized the ultimate threat to their exploitation. They took a revolutionary who demanded systemic economic change and turned him into a symbol of passive acceptance.
Which brings us to a massive structural problem. If this revolution is so explicitly detailed in the original Arabic text of the Quran, how did the ritual trap manage to cover it up for so long?
Yeah, because Parwez isn't discovering new scrolls buried in a cave somewhere. He is reading the exact same Arabic words that have been recited by millions of people for centuries.
Right.
If the text says, Jesus fought the central bank, how did we end up with translations that say, Jesus prayed quietly?
Because the architects of the ritual trap didn't need to change the physical words of the Quran. That was actually impossible due to its preservation. Instead, they simply changed what people believed those words meant.
They changed the dictionary.
They altered the dictionaries. Parwez argues that over centuries, heavily influenced by Persian imperial culture, Christian monastic traditions, and general linguistic drift, the foundational Arabic terms of the Quran were contaminated.
Contaminated how?
They were stripped of their systemic operational definitions and replaced with purely religious mystical definitions.
So we're talking about a linguistic manipulation. You keep the outer shell of the word looking exactly the same, but you completely hollow out the inside and replace its meaning.
Exactly.
To decode this, we have to look at what the source material provides, the linguistic piece. The lecture deep dives into 3 specific Arabic terms that have been completely mistranslated in the popular consciousness. Let's start with word number 1, kufri.
This is foundational. In traditional mazhab-based religion, kufr is almost universally translated simply as disbelief.
Right.
It is viewed as an individual theological sin. Someone hearing about a specific deity or creed and making a personal internal choice not to believe it. It's framed purely as a spiritual failing.
Which makes total sense if you view religion purely as a set of beliefs. You either believe the list of facts or you don't.
But Parwez utilizes the classical root-based Arabic framework, what he calls the Kitab. When you look at the operational root of the word kuf, it means to conceal, to bury, or to actively deny and cover up the truth.
Okay, so it's an action.
Yes. Now apply this to verse 3.52, which states that Jesus sensed kuf from the establishment. If kufr means they didn't believe in God, that makes no historical sense.
Right. The people he was opposing were the high priest, they were running the temple, they were arguably the most religious, God-professing people in the entire Roman province. They prayed constantly.
Exactly. So kufr in this context cannot mean a lack of theological belief. Here, kufr represents an organized, simmering, socio-political conspiracy.
A conspiracy.
It is a systemic rebellion against divine equity. It is the unholy alliance of political tyrants and religious monopolies actively working to protect their wealth and brutally crush the equitable system Jesus was trying to build. When the verse says Jesus sensed the kufr, he wasn't sensing that they had weak faith. He sensed the systemic forces of the establishment mobilizing their guards, their wealth, and their political capital to violently suppress his movement.
Okay, moving the definition from you don't believe in my theology to you are actively organizing a political and economic suppression of justice completely shifts the stakes of the entire narrative.
It changes everything.
Which naturally leads to the next question. If Jesus senses this massive, wealthy, armed establishment mobilizing against him, what do they actually do? And that brings us to word number 2, Makr.
Makr is perhaps one of the most dangerously mistranslated words in the text. In traditional religious translations, especially those that were heavily influenced by Urdu vernacular in later centuries, Makr is translated to mean deception, dirty trickery, or malicious plotting.
Wait, if Makr means dirty deception, that creates a massive theological crisis, doesn't it?
Huge one.
Because verse 3.54 famously says, they planned a mock and Allah planned a mock. If we use the traditional translation, you are literally calling God a deceiver, or saying God plays dirty tricks.
Which is deeply problematic and contradictory to the Quran's own assertion of divine absolute truth and justice. But rationally and linguistically, Makr is a completely neutral operational term.
Neutral in what way?
It simply means subtle, highly secret strategic planning, or a clandestine counter-strategy. It's about strategy, not morality. The morality of the Makr depends entirely on who is executing it and for what purpose.
So let's look at the mechanics of the opposition's Makr. What was the Roman and Jewish establishment's secret strategy?
Their Makr was a highly calculated political plot to arrest Jesus covertly and have him executed via crucifixion. And we have to understand why crucifixion specifically.
Yeah, they didn't just want him dead. They could have easily assassinated him in an alleyway.
Exactly. They wanted him crucified because under the religious law of the time, anyone hung on a tree was considered cursed by God.
Ah, so it was a character assassination as much as a physical one? They wanted to give him a cursed death to utterly ruin his credibility as a divine messenger in the eyes of the masses. Like, look at your revolutionary leader dying the death of a cursed criminal.
Exactly. It was a brilliant, devastating strategic plot. So what was the divine response? It wasn't a magic trick.
Right.
It wasn't God waving a wand and making an illusion of Jesus appear on the cross while the real Jesus vanished, which is what some later mythological traditions actually claim.
I've heard that one.
The divine response was a superior Makr, a highly subtle strategic countermeasure. The source material draws a direct structural comparison here to the Hijra of Prophet Muhammad.
Let's unpack the Hijra comparison, because I think that grounds this concept in reality perfectly.
Think about the mechanics of the Hijra. Prophet Muhammad was in Mecca. The ruling Quraysh tribe totally threatened by his message of socioeconomic equity, formed an alliance. They surrounded his house at night with assassins from every single clan.
So they shared the blame.
Right. Their Makr was to murder him and distribute the blame so no single tribe could be held responsible.
A highly strategic political assassination plot.
Yes. So what was the divine counter-strategy? Did angels descend with flaming swords? Did the prophet teleport to Medina? No. The Makr was a meticulously planned covert extraction.
An extraction.
The prophet left under the cover of darkness, utilizing the blind spots of the guards, took a complex, counterintuitive route south instead of north, hid in the cave of Thar for 3 days until the search parties gave up, and then utilized an expert local guide to navigate the harsh desert to Medina. It was a masterclass in strategic evasion.
It was a protective protocol, a highly strategic relocation to move the leadership out of the oppressor's reach so the movement could survive and build its markaz, its central authority, elsewhere.
Precisely. And the lecture argues that God's Makr in response to the plot against Jesus was structurally identical. It was a strategic clandestine operation to safely extract Jesus from the immediate grip of the Roman and temple guards, neutralizing their attempt to publicly crucify and humiliate him.
This makes so much sense. It brings the entire narrative out of the realm of comic book magic and into the realm of real-world, high-stakes political strategy.
Exactly.
But hold on. This naturally forces us to confront the biggest elephant in the room. If God's counter-strategy wasn't a magic trick, how did Jesus actually escape the crucifixion plot? Because the traditional mainstream story relies entirely on a supernatural exit.
Right.
And that brings us to the most controversial linguistic key in the lecture. Word number 3, or rather a pair of words, mutawafika and rafa.
These two words are the absolute epicenter of the historical distortion. Let's look at how the Mazhab trap translates them.
Okay.
According to traditional religious narratives, which were heavily influenced by imported Christian lore and later mythologies, Jesus did not die. Instead, the translation of Rafa is presented as a physical levitation.
Levitation.
Yeah. The story goes that Jesus was physically lifted, alive, in his biological human body, up into the sky, past the clouds, and into the fourth heaven to sit and wait.
And the sources we have today from Parwez tear that idea completely apart.
They absolutely dismantle it, fundamentally on philosophical and linguistic grounds. Let's start with the first word God speaks to Jesus in verse 3.55. Mutawafika.
What does the root say?
The rational etymological analysis of the Arabic root word WFY guarantees the natural completion of a term or an obligation. In the context of a human lifespan, it explicitly means a natural physical death.
A natural death.
Yes. It is a divine assurance. God is telling Jesus, they are plotting to give you an unnatural, violent, cursed death on a cross. I assure you their plot will fail. I will ensure you complete your natural lifespan and die a natural death.
Okay, so the text explicitly promises a natural death. But what about the second word, Rafe? If it doesn't mean physically flying up into the sky, what does it actually mean? Because the verse says, I will do Rafa of you to myself.
To understand Rafa, we have to look at the mechanics of Quranic philosophy. Translating Rafa's physical ascension creates a catastrophic theological contradiction. It implies that God resides in a specific physical spatial location, that God is literally up there in the sky, or sitting in a specific dimension called the fourth heaven, and therefore Jesus had to physically travel through space to reach him.
Right. If God is omnipresent, which the text repeatedly claims, famously stating that God is closer to a human than their own jugular vein, why would Jesus need to fly into outer space to be raised to him?
Exactly.
If God is closer than my own neck, moving physically upward doesn't get me any closer to him.
Exactly. The physical translation makes no philosophical sense within the text's own established framework. Therefore, Rafa must be understood in its systemic, rational Arabic usage. It means an elevation of status, an exaltation of ranks, honor, and dignity.
Status, not altitude.
Yes. Look at the context of the Makr. The opposition's plot was to crucify him, to permanently degrade his status, to label him a cursed criminal in the eyes of history.
So God's counter-promise of Rafa is the ultimate rebuttal. They are trying to humiliate you and erase your legacy with a cursed death. But I will elevate your status. I will exalt your honor so highly that your name and your cause will outlast their entire empire.
Yes. It is the elevation of his historical and spiritual dignity, vindicating his truth against the propaganda of the Abar.
Think about what happens when we change these definitions. It's like a psychological Trojan horse. If the establishment convinces you that elevation means literally flying into space, what do? You look up at the clouds, you
Right.
start looking for magic, you wait for supernatural events to drop out of the sky and solve your worldly problems. But if elevation means that your historical honor will outlast your oppressors because you stood up for a just system, you stop looking at the clouds. You start looking at your community. You start organizing.
And that is the exact psychological shift the architects of Mazhab desperately wanted to prevent. A population waiting for a magical savior to return from the fourth heaven is a passive population.
They won't rebel.
They won't challenge the emperor's taxes. They won't challenge the high priest's wealth. They will just sit quietly and wait.
Okay, so we have the linguistic keys. We understand that kufr is systemic oppression and the hoarding of wealth. We understand Makr is high-stakes strategic planning. We understand Rafa is the elevation of historical honor through justice.
The foundational terms.
Right. Now that we have these keys, what happens when we apply them to the other people in the story? What about Jesus's followers? The guy sitting with him in verse 3.52 when the systemic suppression breaks out.
Applying this framework completely rewrites our understanding of the disciples, known in the text as the Hawariyyun. In the traditional histories, particularly the gospel narratives shaped by later empires, the disciples are subjected to massive character assassination.
Really? Like how?
They are consistently depicted as cowardly, bumbling men of little faith. The famous narrative is that when the Roman guards finally come to arrest Jesus, his chief disciple Peter denies even knowing him 3 times to save his own skin, and the rest of the disciples just scatter into the night and abandon him.
It's a remarkably depressing picture of his closest friends and followers. They basically look like fair-weather fans who fold at the first sign of real danger.
But Parwez's rational reading of Surah Al-Imran argues that this too is a total fabrication. It is the slander of Mazhab.
Wow.
Think about it. If you want to crush a revolutionary movement, you don't just pacify the leader. You have to discredit his vanguard. You turn revolutionaries into passive hermits and cowards so no one wants to emulate them.
That makes total sense.
Let's look at what the Quranic text actually says happened in verse 3.52. When Jesus sensed the kufr, when he realized the organized, heavily armed, systemic oppression of the temple and the state was moving to crush them, he didn't retreat to a mountain to cry and pray for a magical rescue.
Right.
He issued a clear, revolutionary call to action. He looked at his followers and asked, "Who are my Ansar? Who are my helpers in the cause of God?"
He's basically saying, the guards are coming, the establishment is mobilizing, who is standing with me? And the disciples didn't run away?
No. They boldly stepped forward. They declared, "We are the Ansarullah, the helpers of the divine system." They weren't a disorganized group of frightened peasants. They were a highly disciplined, ideological vanguard.
They knew the risks.
They knew exactly what they were up against. They understood the power of the Roman military and the brutality of the temple guards, and they pledged their unwavering support and their lives anyway.
The lecture structurally equates their bravery to a very specific event in Islamic history, doesn't it? The pledge of the Sahaba at Hudaybiyah.
Yes, and we need to unpack the weight of that comparison so the listener understands the gravity of what the Hawariyyun did.
Let's do it.
At the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, Prophet Muhammad and his companions, the Sahaba, were camped outside Mecca. They were unarmed, wearing pilgrimage clothes, and completely vulnerable. The massive, heavily armed Meccan army was mobilizing to wipe them out.
Sounds like a trap.
It was. Rumors spread that the Prophet's emissary had been assassinated. It looked like absolute certain death. In that moment, the Prophet sat under a tree and asked for a pledge of allegiance, the Bayat al-Ridwan. Every single companion stepped forward and pledged to fight to the death to defend the messenger and the system, despite facing overwhelming odds.
It's considered one of the defining moments of bravery and ideological discipline in history.
Exactly. And the source material argues that the Hawariyyun, the disciples of Jesus, exhibited that exact same structural bravery. When the Roman and temple forces mobilized their Makr, the disciples didn't scatter. They took the pledge. They stood as a vanguard.
And the text then calls them al-shahidin, the witnesses. They say, write us down among the witnesses. But again, we have to avoid falling back into the ritual trap here.
Like,
what does it actually mean to be a witness in this context? Because usually, bearing witness just means standing in a congregation and verbally reciting a creed, like, I bear witness that God is one.
verbal recitation is the Mazhab definition. It costs you nothing to say words. But in the act of din, being a witness, a shaheed requires immense physical and material sacrifice. It means becoming the physical, practical evidence of the ideology in the real world.
How so? Provide an example of how you mechanically bear witness.
You bear witness to the truth of an equitable economic system by physically building it, funding it, and defending it against the kufr. It means willingly offering your life, your wealth, your resources, and your energy to dismantle exploitative monopolies.
Putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. If the system demands that no one goes hungry, you bear witness by ensuring your wealth is circulated to the poor, even if the Roman tax collectors or the temple priests threaten you for not giving it to them instead. You become the living, breathing proof that a better, equitable world is possible.
That's powerful.
The disciples asked to be recorded in history as the men who physically built and defended the system, not just men who believed it in their hearts.
It is genuinely tragic when you think about it. The tragedy of history, the monumental bravery of a highly disciplined ideological vanguard was systematically erased. It was scrubbed from the popular historical narrative to make them look like passive, cowardly beggars.
That's awful.
And why? Because if the ruling classes can convince you that your historical heroes were cowards who just accepted oppression and waited for the afterlife, then you'll be a coward who accepts oppression and waits for the afterlife. They stripped future generations of a revolutionary role model.
That is the ultimate chilling goal of Mazhab, to pacify the vanguard before it can even form.
Okay, we've covered massive ground. We've established that Jesus and the Hawariyyun were a revolutionary vanguard fighting an oppressive, extractive system. We know what they were fighting against.
Right.
But what exactly were they fighting for? What is the actual blueprint they wanted to implement? If they win, if they successfully dismantle the Roman taxes and the temple monopolies, what does society actually look like the next morning?
That brings us to the core economic engine of this entire philosophy, a concept Parwez details deeply. Nizami Rububiyat, the system of providence.
Nizami Rububiyat. Let's break down the mechanics of the system. What does it actually do?
In the most fundamental terms, Nizami Rububiyat is an economic and social framework where the basic sustenance of every single human being, bread, shelter, healthcare, education, developmental resources, is guaranteed as a fundamental, non-negotiable human right by the divine system.
Guaranteed, meaning it is not earned through grueling, exploitative labor for a feudal lord or a modern corporation, and it is certainly not something you have to beg for.
Exactly. And most importantly, and the lecture stresses this heavily, it is not dispensed as charity. We have to differentiate between systemic equity and charity. The source material is highly critical of the concept of private charity as a substitute for systemic justice.
Let's pull on that thread. Why is charity criticized here? Isn't giving to the poor a good thing?
Individual generosity is fine, sure, but as a systemic model, charity is a symptom of a sick society. Think about the mechanics of an exploitative capitalist system or a feudal empire.
Okay.
The ruling elite extract and hoard the vast majority of the wealth. They artificially impoverish the masses by monopolizing resources. Then, to prevent a violent revolt and to make themselves feel morally superior, they occasionally toss crumbs back down to the masses in the form of charity.
It's a psychological control mechanism. The billionaire pays no taxes, hoards the wealth generated by his workers, and then donates a fraction of it to build a hospital with his name on it. He gets to say, "Look how generous I am with the resources I extracted from your labor." And the poor are supposed to be grateful.
Precisely. Under Nizami Rububiyat, basic needs are never a favor granted by the rich. They are a systemic right managed by the Markaz, the central authority of the din.
The Makaz?
Right. The wealth is systematically circulated so that extreme hoarding is mathematically impossible. And no citizen ever has to suffer the indignity of begging another human being for their survival.
But how does the Markaz, this central government, actually manage this without just becoming another tyrannical Roman state? How do they implement this blueprint? The sources say the first step was eradicating something called secular dualism. What does that mean in the context of the first century and today?
Secular dualism is the historical, unholy compromise that keeps the masses subjugated across almost all civilizations. It is the division of authority into two spheres. It's the idea that the state controls the political administration, the military, the macroeconomy, and the penal code, the secular laws.
Right.
Meanwhile, the state allows religious authorities to control personal laws, family disputes, marriages, and spiritual life.
It's the classic render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's. You split the jurisdiction.
Yes, and Parwez's lecture argues that this dualism is not a peaceful compromise. It is an incredibly dangerous trap designed to crush the individual. Let's look at the mechanics of why. When you split authority, the state handles the money, the physical force, and the resource extraction. The priests handle the guilt, the moral policing, and the promise of the afterlife. The common people are squeezed in a vice between the two.
So they're attacked from both sides.
Exactly. They're forced to beg the state for their physical needs, jobs, security, bread, and they're forced to beg the priests for their spiritual salvation. Neither institution actually cares about the holistic development of the human being.
So the blueprint of Din demands dismantling the priesthood entirely.
Fiercely and unapologetically, the lecture reserves its harshest condemnations for the Abar and Reuben, the professional religious elites. And this isn't limited to the first-century Jewish establishment. The concept applies universally to any religious monopoly, regardless of the faith.
That's a bold claim.
The text argues that a professional priesthood creates a labyrinth of self-made, complex religious laws. They demand the poor bow to them for spiritual scraps, pay them for rituals, and revere them as holy men, all while these priests turn a blind eye to, or even actively profit from, the economic starvation of those same poor people by the state.
So if we apply this directly to you, the listener, right now, if you are living in a society where you are relying on the elite to occasionally grant you charity or a slight wage increase while they hoard the vast majority of resources, you aren't living in an equitable system.
You're not.
You are living in the exact subjugation, the exact dualism that this ancient blueprint was trying to destroy. You are trapped. So how does the Markaz actually fix this dualism?
The Markaz acts as the unified governing body. In a true din, there is absolutely no separation between the secular state and the religious sphere. Why? Because the divine law covers all of it, and its primary overriding objective is equity.
The two spheres become one.
Exactly. The moral law is the economic law. The Markaz ensures the equitable distribution of resources based on universal, permanent values. It completely eliminates the need for private religious tribunals that exploit human guilt, and it systematically dismantles capitalist monopolies that exploit human labor. Under the Markaz, your physical nourishment and your developmental nourishment are secured as a single, unified right.
It's a unified socioeconomic welfare system driven by a permanent moral law, rather than driven by profit motives or spiritual extortion.
That is exactly what it is, and that is why the Roman imperial administration and the Jewish temple establishment had to crush Jesus and his vanguard. It was never about theology.
Right.
It was never about whether God was one or three. It was about the control of wealth and the dismantling of their extraction machines.
Which brings us to the inevitable climax of this conflict. What happens to a society that refuses to adopt this economic equity? Let's say a society, maybe the Roman Empire, maybe a modern global superpower, looks at this blueprint, rejects it, clings to its monopolies, loves its exploitative capitalism, and keeps the masses begging.
They ignore the blueprint.
Yeah. Do they just get bad karma? Do they just face some vague spiritual punishment in the afterlife?
No. This brings us to a fascinating concept the lecture introduces, called the social physics of the Quran, which is specifically detailed in verses 3.56 and 5.7. The framework is called the law of requital.
The law of requital. Explain the mechanics of this, because I want to make sure we aren't just talking about divine retribution.
We must absolutely strip away the mythological, emotional view of punishment. The law of requital is not an angry, emotional God sitting on a cloud, getting offended, and throwing lightning bolts at people who disobey him. It is a strict, unavoidable mathematical law of societal mechanics. It is quite literally the science of human history.
Social physics. I love that term. How does the physics work?
It is the scientific consequence of social conduct. The verses state that those who engage in kufr, and remember our linguistic key, kufr means systemic rebellion against equity, hoarding wealth, and monopolizing resources, will face severe punishment in both dunya, which is the present physical world, and akhirah, the hereafter.
Let's focus on the dunya, the present world. So it's not just wait until you die and you'll go to hell. The collapse happens here in real time. How does an empire actually fall from economic injustice? What is the mechanical trigger?
Tyrannies that build their economies on exploitation are structurally unsound. They will inevitably collapse under the weight of their own historical consequences. Let's trace the mechanics.
Walk me through it.
The ruling elite concentrate wealth. This removes purchasing power from the masses. The masses become desperate, which leads to social unrest. To suppress the unrest, the elite must heavily fund a massive military and police force.
Which costs money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This requires more wealth extraction, leading to currency debasement and hyperinflation. Eventually, the societal bonds completely break, the infrastructure crumbles, and the system implodes from within, making it vulnerable to external collapse.
It's like structural engineering.
Yeah.
You can't build a massive skyscraper out of rotting wood and rusted steel and then act surprised when the wind blows and it collapses, blaming divine wrath or bad luck.
Right.
The blueprint says an economy built on human exploitation is structurally, mathematically unsound, and it will fall.
That is a perfect analogy. The expert points to the source's primary historical example to prove this physics, the ultimate earthly destruction of the oppressive Roman Empire. Rome didn't fall because of bad luck. It collapsed under its own bloated, exploitative weight.
And the temple.
Look at the Jewish religious establishment in Jerusalem. Shortly after the time of Jesus, in 70 A.D., the temple was utterly destroyed by the Romans, and that corrupt priesthood was absolutely dismantled, leaving them scattered and powerless for centuries. The law of requital caught up to their kufr.
So the physics work in the negative. Exploitation guarantees collapse. But what about the positive? Does a blueprint guarantee success if you follow it?
Yes. Conversely, verse 3.57 details the law of just returns, or ADL. It guarantees that for those who believe and act constructively, those who actually organize, pledge as the vanguard, and fight for the equitable system, their human effort is compensated justly.
Universal justice.
Yes, universal justice ensures that no constructive effort is ever wasted. In a true din, your labor is not extracted by a ruling elite to build their palaces. It is returned to you and your community in full measure, generating stability, growth, and security.
So the laws of societal survival are tied directly to economic justice. You absolutely cannot survive on religious rituals, no matter how beautiful they are, if your economic engine is broken.
Exactly.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've moved from passive religion to active revolution. We've decoded the linguistic keys, explored the vanguard, unpacked the markas, and detailed the social physics of societal collapse.
It's a lot to take in.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's synthesize the grand takeaways. The permanent values extracted from Allama Parwez's lecture, so you have a clear framework moving forward. Value number 1, the inevitability of systemic clash.
Crucial.
Whenever advocates of true equity attempt to implement justice, vested interests, the unholy alliance of corrupt politicians and wealthy religious elites will inevitably align to crush them. It is not an anomaly, it is a historical guarantee.
Value number 2. The absolute supremacy of divine laws of consequence over human exploitative conspiracies. The elites may have their Makr, their vast wealth, their secret plots, and their massive PR campaigns to rewrite history. But the law of requital, the social physics of justice, will ultimately outmaneuver them.
Always.
Systems of oppression always mathematically contain the seeds of their own destruction.
And value number 3. The epistemological superiority of the Quranic texts in protecting the true, honorable history of revolutionary messengers. When human-written histories and empires try to slander heroes like Jesus and his disciples, painting them as cowards or passive victims to serve the ruling class's agenda, returning to the original linguistic roots of the blueprint restores their honor and their true revolutionary status.
If we synthesize all of these permanent values into a single, cohesive thought, it is this. The blueprint proves definitively that a society cannot survive, no matter how many prayers it recites, how many rituals it performs, or how tall its temples and skyscrapers are, if its economic engine is built on human exploitation and the denial of basic sustenance as a human right.
Ritual cannot and will not save an unjust economy from the law of requital.
Never.
Which brings us to a massive, slightly uncomfortable question. This civilizational blueprint guarantees the ultimate collapse of any system that hoards wealth, monopolizes resources, relies on debt traps, and denies basic sustenance. So look out your window today.
Yeah, look around.
Look at our modern global economy. Look at the massive wealth inequality, the monopolized corporate resources, the fact that millions beg for basic health care while a few hoard billions. What exact stage of the law of requital are we in right now? And what is the mechanism that will trigger the inevitable collapse of our current dualism?
That is the precipice we are standing on globally. We are watching the social physics play out in real time right in front of us. And understanding that mechanism of collapse is exactly what we must explore in the next step of this series.
So as you go about the rest of your day, I want to leave you with one last provocative thought to mull over. If the religious texts, the cultural histories, and the societal norms you grew up with convinced you that the greatest heroes of human history were just passive, cowardly men who accepted suffering, didn't fight back, and told you to just wait for justice in the afterlife,
Ask yourself this.
who exactly benefits from keeping you waiting?
It certainly isn't you.
No, it isn't. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. It's been a heavy, mind-bending journey through history and economics, but hopefully you're looking at that ancient blueprint entirely differently now. We'll catch you next time.